As you get older, one of the experiences that you start to have more and more often, unfortunately, is finding out that somebody who you'd previously spent a good bit of time with and had connections with is gone and died without you even knowing about it. So I was in a conversation about a week ago with somebody, and I was reminiscing about the city of Carbondale, where I did my graduate studies in philosophy, both the master's and the PhD. Carbondale's in Southern Illinois, and so it's, Southern Illinois University Carbondale is the university there. And like a lot of university towns, that tends to attract people who, have businesses that cater to students. And because there was such a large graduate presence, you could find a great bookstore there in town. And I'm going to talk shortly about that. It was called Rosetta News, and about the guy who ran it. He was a co-owner, and his nickname was Sig. His actual name was Sigurd, Utgaard, very, Germanic name there. And anyway, we were talking about something, and I was trying to bring to mind the name of this guy, in part because we were mentioning the postmodern and literacy, and this book by Fredric, Jameson, Postmodernism, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, came up. So anyway, I ended up going online and trying to track down what was the name of that bookstore that I spent so much time in. And as it turns out, it was Rosetta News. And you see it right here, the sticker. I bought this at Rosetta News, 20% off. Apparently, it was originally $19.95, and then, it had been marked down. I've never succeeded in actually taking this sticker off of the text. So SIG was kind of a feature, and Rosetta News was a feature by the time that I got to Carbondale. And, one of the cool things about graduate school, if you're in a program that's good in this sense, that people actually talk to each other and hang out and spend time with each other and introduce you to the surrounding area, you get to know people and places that are already there. For example, there were two coffee shops in town. One was, actually both of them were kind of on the strip, but one was at the very end of it. So there was the one, and I forget the name of it, and it was, more the ritzy place. You'd go in, and it's a little bit fancier and all that, and it was kind of nice. And then there was the Long Branch, which was the sort of, run-down, hippie-ish, flannel-wearing, might be people do an open mic there on certain times, and you could also get all sorts of foodstuffs there as well place. And so there are all sorts of things like that, and restaurants and, places to go, places to hear bands. So anyway, one of the things you really need at any good university town is a bookstore, or preferably multiple bookstores. And there were, in fact, multiple bookstores. And when I say along the strip, there's a highway that runs through town, and a lot of the businesses are located alongside of it, either on the side that's going one way or the side that's going the other way. So there was a used bookstore I used to love to go to. There was, of course, the 710 University bookstore, where you could buy books that weren't even for your classes. You could check out what they were doing in other classes and pick up stuff. And then there was Rosetta News. And Rosetta News, I got introduced to it, I think, by my friend Gary, who was a year ahead of me in his master's studies. And he's like, you got to check this place out. It's really awesome. So, we go there, and it was the kind of place where you could get all sorts of interesting stuff that didn't all map onto each other or match up. So I was there mainly for like the philosophy theory books, and he had a great selection there at Rosetta News. And Sig was there, and Gary introduced me to Sig, And, we'd chat, and Sig was very, very interested in everybody and what they were into, and he could make great book recommendations. As it turned out, he actually had a degree in philosophy from SIU, and in philosophy and German. So he actually, had quite a good background, came from a family of people who were quite literate, academics. And so anyway, he and I think his name was Michael, his partner in the business, established Rosetta News to be the place that you would go to find all the cool, up-to-date theory stuff, but also independent movies. They had a room in the back with, at that time it was all video cassettes, and it was arranged according to author. So if you got into Abe Ferrara, right, all those movies are right there, and he could make recommendations. And then there was like the weird, wacky, metaphysical crystal crowd kind of stuff over on that side. And there were like fetish magazines over there, and Sig was pretty good about not letting kids look at the stuff. And then there was like, the contemporary, let's call them intelligentsia, think tanky kind of magazines over there, like, Foreign Policy. And that's where I actually started reading First Things, back before it had a massive decline in quality. And a bunch of other things as well. And I remember this, I was kind of an elitist about this at the time. There was a huge selection of Philip K. Dick books, because a lot of people were into Philip K. Dick back then. And I was like, I don't read that sort of crap, not realizing how great Philip K. Dick was until later on, probably about a decade later. So anyway, you'd go into Rosetta News, and almost invariably, Sig would be there. If he wasn't there, Michael would be there. And you would, kind of look through stuff and maybe purchase something. But Sig was always up for a conversation. He was interested, what classes are you taking? And, I had that professor. And it wasn't just like the philosophy crowd. One of the great things about Carbondale was that the philosophy department, not so much in the professors, but in terms of the graduate students, massive overlap with speech communications, which was across campus, English, history, political science, foreign languages, sociology, anthropology, film studies, all these sorts of things. You could have people in your classes from other departments, and you could go and check out their classes. And very often at the parties that you would go to in town, or the events, you would run into people that you would know from these other departments. And Sig was somebody who wasn't an academic, but he like knew everybody, because he'd been there for a long, long time in Carbondale. And so, he was conversant with what was going on. Michael, a bit less so. Michael was more of just a businessman who saw something there. I'm not exactly sure what their ultimate relationship was, but sometimes it could be a bit tense, you could say, about because they were always trying to make a living with this business. But I think Sig was much more interested in a life of the mind that included general culture. So you could get into great conversations. I remember when the Lord of the Rings movies started coming out, talking with him about how close are these to the books, and even more importantly, how much should that matter? Should we be like, well, if it's deviating from the books, it's no good? And we had like philosophical conversations about that sort of stuff, and other people would join in. So in a way, Rosetta News was kind of like a philosophical / cultural salon, but it was also a place of business. And then Sig got himself an espresso machine, and would make coffees there, and then people would stand around. And it's interesting, there weren't any seats except behind, I think, the counter, but you'd stand around and chit-chat and, look through things, and then maybe buy something other than a coffee, in part because you could use it, or because it would, be beneficial to help keeping this institution afloat. I ended up leaving Carbondale in 2002 after I finished my dissertation. And unbeknownst to me, Rosetta News had been suffering, in part because there was a recession that had hit in the early 2000s, spurred in part because of the crazy investing in the internet, but also because things like Amazon were really cutting into the what they call mom and pop booksellers, cutting into their margins, making it difficult for them to operate. And Sig wasn't selling used books; he was selling new books. So he was directly competing with Amazon, as well as there was a Barnes and Nobles in town, but they didn't have any of the selection that Rosetta News did. So they weren't that much of a competitor. So anyway, I didn't realize this, but Rosetta News was struggling for quite a while, and shortly after I left, it ended up having to close down. It did reopen for a while when some other people came in and essentially bought the business, pooled their money, started it back up, because it was an important institution in town, but they weren't able to keep it going either. And so it's part of the legacy, the lost legacy of a time, 3.5 decades ago, back in Carbondale. Carbondale's, in much worse shape than it was back then as well. So I don't think we'll ever see something like Rosetta News come about. And I read some obituaries about Sig, and I found out quite a few things that I didn't know. He died a little under a year ago, March 28th, 2023, at his home in Alton. He grew up in Carbondale, right? And this is kind of cool. He always spoke about the town as a magical place where cultures, family, and academic purists melded together. Carbondale was also the home to the famed Rosetta News bookstore, owned and operated by Sig, who eagerly recommended books and brewed espresso. And it tells you a lot of other of his life's passions. I'll actually put a link to this down below. And there's things I didn't know about Sig, but my interactions with him weren't just in this store. He was always out and about. Like if there was some festival going on, sooner or later you run into Sig, right? And it wouldn't just be in Carbondale. It could be in some of the other local towns. There's a parade. Hey, there's Sig. So and I went to a few parties where we got to hang out as well. That was quite nice. So it was kind of a shock to find out that he died. He's not that much older than I was. I believe he was born in 1964, so that would make him about 6 years older than me. So he was under 60 when he died. So that's kind of unfortunate. Now, I'd shown you a book earlier, and I wanted to mention this in particular with respect to Sig. So one day I asked him, how do you know so much about all these different philosophy, culture, history, literary, artistic matters? And he said, well, I'll let you in on a little secret. So, he had a philosophy degree, and he had a German degree, and he'd read a lot of stuff. But he said, what was really the turning point for me? I got a hold of this book because somebody in one of my classes said that you have to read this book. So, Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism by Fredric, Jameson. If you're going to talk about postmodernism and you haven't actually read this book, you probably need to keep your mouth shut, because this is like one of the key early works in trying to figure out what postmodernism actually is. And it's a great book. So, first printing was 1991. This is the sixth printing from 1995, right? So it was very much of the time. And so he said, you see this book? And he went and he got it off the shelf. And he's like, I read this, and there were so many different references in it, because that's the way Jameson writes, I couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about, 2/3 of the time. So what I decided to do is everything in here that he references, every author, every text. So for example, here on page 160, right, he's referencing Marcuse's one-dimensional man, and then he talks about Ventura's irony, Achille Bonito Oliva's idealization. Then he talks about Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, Ernest Kallenbach's Ecotopia, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. That's just through the first half of the page. Sig said, I'll just read all these texts that he's referencing and see what they're talking about. And I was like, wow, that's pretty hardcore, man. How long did it take you? And he said, about 5 years. But I came out of it knowing a ton of stuff. Obviously, I haven't read everything, but just reading all the different authors and texts that are mentioned in this book helped me understand this book, but it also created this vast network of interconnected ideas and texts, and it really did help me wrap my head around a lot of cultural things that I wouldn't have otherwise known about, and I didn't do it to take a class or anything. I was doing this for me. I wanted to understand, and I was like, there's a lot of books you could probably do that with, but this is a pretty good one for that. Now, I myself haven't read every single text that is mentioned in this book. By the way, there's a term for that. We call that intertextuality, when texts are referring to other texts and they get their own meaning partly out of that reference and engagement with the other text, right? It creates a kind of a network. And that's in some respects, a postmodern idea and ideal. So there's a lot of interconnected parts here. Anyway, as you can tell, I purchased this at Rosetta News. That's one of their stickers right there from that very store where he had used this as an example before putting the 20% off sticker on it. I like bargains. And, I've read this through myself because I wanted to understand this important work, and I think that it's quite good in many respects. So, no great moral to this story. I just wanted to memorialize somebody who at one time had been a friend, and then we'd lost touch enough that I didn't realize that he'd had to sell Rosetta News and that he'd, died about a year ago. Had a whole other career afterwards, a school teacher, did lots and lots of volunteer work in local communities. And it was, it's sad to find out that he died relatively young, but I think he, on the whole, had a pretty good life, and his life certainly touched a lot of other people, including myself, in ways that I think were, beneficial, good. He kind of gave, he was always a mellow guy. He could get upset about some things, but I actually learned from engaging with him, matters like how to disagree with somebody in a way that's productive about ideas that we care about without letting things get personal, So anyway, that's my little story about Sig and a way of kind of keeping him in mind. I'm sharing it with you and hope that you will, find this little glimpse into who he was something attractive and maybe worth reflecting on.